Have you ever wondered if and or when you might tell a potential partner about your abuse history? Or really, potentially anybody that you might have a close relationship with? If so, today's video is for you. Hi, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. I'm very happy to have you here. Make sure to subscribe and click the little bell for notifications. So today I'm actually answering a question that came in from somebody in our community wondering about this. And this is something that comes up a lot for people that have a history of something that they feel is really significant. And oftentimes they feel like they have an obligation to tell somebody. So I'm going to talk about this from in a few different ways, I suppose. So while the majority of this is going to be about a potential partner or an existing partner, I think some of it will also apply to just thinking about disclosing your history with even a potential friend. So there are some things that I think are important to keep in mind. So this community member, actually specifically asked a couple of things. One was advice, just kind of generally, but also how might you know if and when to tell somebody, if it's okay to tell them in regards to how they might respond, what to do if they don't respond well, and are there any kind of green flags or potentially red flags to look out for. So it's a lot to cover, and I have talked about this a little bit in some other videos in certain ways as well. So I first want to address the idea that there's an obligation for you to share your history with your partner. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I can see why some people think that there might be an obligation, but I really don't think that there is. Generally speaking, there may be some caveats to that, but generally speaking, I don't think that there is an obligation. You don't owe your partner. And one of the reasons that this tends to come up a lot is because people feel like they are damaged. And they feel like they believe that their partner has a right to know how damaged they actually are. So from that perspective, you do not owe your partner your history. And what that is based in, the idea that you're damaged and therefore you have to warn your partner, that's a lot that still needs healing. It isn't true, first of all, that you're damaged and so damaged that you have to tell your partner, warn your partner about this. The truth is that everybody is wounded, right? We all have ways of showing up in the world, and especially in relationship, that isn't necessarily healthy, and that can be absolutely without any history of specifically like childhood trauma or really even trauma in general. Just that most people are unaware of how that shows up in relationship. So you don't owe somebody that explanation, and you certainly don't owe it because you're so damaged. However, having said that, I think that in a healthy relationship, ideally you would feel very comfortable sharing your history. Well, let me adjust that a little bit. Ideally, you would feel completely comfortable, but in all reality, people don't feel completely comfortable until they've done a whole lot of healing. So you're likely going to feel some unease around it anyway, especially if this relationship means something to you. So if you are in a relationship, especially if it's going to be a long-term committed relationship, ideally you would be able to share with your partner, not because you owe them, not because you have to warn them about how messed up you are, but because it's a pretty significant part of your life. It may have a bearing on how you feel about yourself, your relationships with your family members, some of the things that you're maybe currently working through. So in that sense, it is still part of your life. And anything that is a part of your life, especially if it's challenging, ideally you'd be able to share that with your partner. Whether it's relatively early in the relationship or certainly if it's been an ongoing relationship for a long time. At what point do you share that you have a history? There isn't really a right or wrong answer here. I think it depends on the kinds of conversations you have, how comfortable you feel, maybe how many people you've shared your history with, because that's going to increase or decrease depending on how you've been responded to, your level of comfort, and possibly even shame in sharing. So generally, I would say, unless you're having some really specific conversations early on, it's not something that you would necessarily share immediately. You could share something somewhat general. And I want to be clear, it is okay for you to share it if that's what you feel like you want to do, as long as it's not because you feel like you owe them. Okay? So that's pretty different. Now, if you're just in a stage in your life where it seems like talking about your abuse is something that is kind of constantly there, and it's a conversation that would lend itself to talking about certain things, like if you're sharing personal histories, if you're sharing the things that have had the most impact on you, if you're sharing the things that concern you the most in the world, like any of that, then it would be kind of a natural part of the conversation. So early on, it can make sense to share. But generally speaking, especially if it's somebody who potentially could mean something to you, I think while you may share something very general like, yeah, with my background, I'm much more aware of some of this stuff, or yeah, I happen to know a lot about that, which is why I believe this, or something along that line. The more that you get to know the person, the more you will know. So going to like the green flags and red flags, the more you'll get a sense of how this person is likely going to respond, how they tend to think about these issues in general. So by having conversations about what's happening generally in the world, right? Whether you're talking about things that are happening related to like genocide or climate issues or women's rights or Me Too, whether people are believed about things or not, I think those are important conversations to have with people relatively early on, because you'll get a good sense of whether or not it's a good match, even as a friend, because you can have an acquaintance who doesn't have the same values as you do. But to be close to somebody that doesn't have the same values as you, I think you can only be so close to somebody, like really close in terms of connection. So having conversations that are meaningful about important topics, I think is actually a really healthy and good thing to do. And again, you don't have to share your personal history, but paying attention to how that person talks about that stuff. When they share, like for example, and this could apply globally, it doesn't have to be particularly in the US, but like for example, right now in the US, there's a lot of conversations around politics and the overturning of Roe v. Wade and race issues. And I mean, there are a lot of things that's happening. And again, this is happening in many countries. So there are a lot of conversations that you could have that would give you a sense of who that person is, how they think about things, how they're likely going to respond to things. So if in those conversations you tend to be on the same page, if they are really supportive of human rights and equal rights, if they believe women, if they believe survivors, if they agree that we as society should create safer places for survivors to come forward and share their stories, for example. If they believe in laws to hold people accountable, those kinds of things will help give you a sense of just how that person tends to view things, right? Because if you think about people in your life, maybe you've shared something with them or not, but if you've heard them talk about, like when Me Too happened, how were they talking about survivors? Were they saying that people were making it up, that they were just wanting attention? If so, there's a good chance that that is not a person you want to talk to about it. And whether that's a partner or a friend or even a family member. If, on the other hand, they were supportive, maybe even, identified openly that they were shocked by how many women had this experience, but in a supportive way, not in a disbelieving way. That is a good indicator that they are open, that they are concerned, that they have an interest in it. And I think for most people, anybody that you've had much of a relationship with, and especially with social media, it's kind of easy to see based on their posts, what they like, what their comments, where they tend to fall under in certain types of issues. So green flags would be, are they communicating about it? Are they open? Are they asking questions? Are they supportive? Red flags would be, do they discount it? Do they minimize it? Are they disbelieving of it? Do they try to shut people down? Those are definitely all red flags. And again, how they respond is going to be based on their value system. And for some people, our value system can be in part based on our ways of coping. So, and this happens even for women who have been abused, and I've talked about this in other videos. There are women and men, but women who have been sexually abused or assaulted who are quick to say that somebody else is lying about it. Fortunately, that is not the typical scenario, but that happens. And the reason that it happens is because that person, generally speaking, is not willing to face their own reality. They're not comfortable with the conversations that are happening. They may feel resentful that somebody is getting support if they've never shared their own story. They may feel envious if somebody is sharing their story and seem comfortable doing it. So there are different things that can happen within that particular person that their value system may seem to suggest that they don't care or that they think people are lying. And in this context, I think that is important to consider as a value, at least for them at this time. Now, our values can shift over time, right? Like the more that we learn, the more we understand, our values can shift. And that's not a bad thing. But again, it's about the indicator of whether this person is safe to share with. How they respond to other people. Do they gossip about other people? Do they tell you things about other people, and are they judgmental about it? So I think if you've known somebody for any length of time, especially with social media, you can get a pretty good sense of where they are, how they think, and how they are likely to respond. Now, of course, there are some people who show up one way on social media and another way when it's one-on-one. And so given that, I think it can be helpful to have your own experiences with that person as well. Again, having some of those conversations, asking how they feel about certain things. Even for somebody who is relatively comfortable, who you might choose to share with, if they care about you because of their own stuff, they may respond in a way that is not ideal. And that isn't about you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something bad about them. Now, obviously, if they respond in a really inappropriate way, probably not a good sign. But if they change the topic quickly or ask you questions or something like that that maybe seem a little bit irrelevant or off topic, it doesn't have to mean something bad. But how you feel in response to that matters. Now, if this person has given you lots of reasons to believe that they would be a supportive person to share with, but their response feels a little shaky, ideally, you might be able to say something to them. You might be able to ask, how are you feeling in what I shared? Or if they've responded in a way that doesn't feel very good to you, you might be able to say something along the lines of, this isn't quite the response that I anticipated, or I'm a little surprised by your response. Because sometimes if you're feeling vulnerable about sharing, even just the way that they look at you, because you're anticipating that they're going to judge you or not like you or something like that, any way that they look at you, you could potentially perceive as judgment or doubt or something along that line. And that is pretty normal, especially if it's somebody that you really care about, because the more you care about that person, the more vulnerable it feels to share. The more vulnerable it feels to share something, the more likely we are to interpret things based on our expectations and fears. So if you can ask to clarify, if you can just ask how they're feeling about it, maybe you could even say something first by, you don't necessarily need to respond, I just want to share something with you. And of course, this is some gender stereotyping here, but many stereotypes are ongoing for kind of a reason. So oftentimes women, when they hear somebody share something, they listen and they empathize, and they will often try to share, maybe they'll share something about themselves as a way to connect. But that can feel dismissive to the person who just shared something, like they're making it all about them. It doesn't have to be that way. It can mean that, but it doesn't always mean that. Men often, when they hear something that is painful for somebody, they often want to fix it. And that could mean a lot of different things. That could look a lot of different ways. And in all reality, when it comes to this, there's no way to fix it, right? And so sometimes for men, and my husband was like this, if there isn't anything that they can do to fix it in that moment, they might try to shut it down, whether they're shutting themselves down or they try to shut you down. Because if they can't fix it, they can feel powerless, and feeling powerless doesn't feel good to anybody. And so to move away from that sense of powerlessness, or even potentially anger, they may try to not continue the conversation, maybe try to change the subject, maybe even potentially push it back on you because you've made them feel that way, which is not accurate, but we can often feel that way, right? So again, male or female, or either or, whichever way somebody responds in one of those two ways, it doesn't mean that you're wrong in sharing. But it is important to keep that in mind so that you don't take it personally. Because if you don't take it personally, then you're more likely to be able to have a conversation with them about your experience of their response. You're able to ask questions. You're able to continue the conversation instead of this person shutting down or you shutting down or both of you shutting down, which is almost always going to end badly. So going back to the idea of timelines, again, there isn't a right or wrong. It is in part your comfort level. The main thing I want you to keep in mind is that you don't owe that person. Now, one thing that I think might be helpful to keep in mind related to that, though, is, and I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, if you know, for example, that one of your ways of coping is to, if you start to feel close to somebody, that you might want to avoid that person. You might even want to do something to sabotage the relationship. In an example like that, or let's say you wake up with nightmares a lot, or there's certain things that are triggering to you that you're likely going to be experiencing around this person or with this person. In situations like that, I think that it can be helpful to just give that person some context. So you don't have to necessarily share your abuse history, but for example, like if you have a partner and you share a space together while you're sleeping and you have nightmares, and whether they wake you up or you talk in your sleep or whatever, but you have nightmares that the person is going to know that there's something going on. Maybe you would just want to let them know that you have a lot of nightmares and that it's not something that they need to worry about. And maybe if they ask, and what are you having nightmares about? And are you sure you're okay? You could say, I'm fine and it's not something I'm really comfortable sharing right now, or I'm not really ready to talk about it yet. You could do that. If you are a person who, as you start to get close to somebody, you want to run the other direction, which is very common for trauma survivors, it may be helpful in a conversation where you're having about kind of how you show up in a relationship, which I think is an important conversation to have with people in the beginning stages of a relationship. You might have a conversation where you would maybe ask the other person as a way to initiate that conversation. Like, so when you're building a relationship with somebody, what are some of the things that you might do that aren't necessarily helpful in the relationship? And maybe you also ask, maybe you even start with, what are some things that you do that you think are really helpful in a relationship? So if they're sharing things that they think are unhelpful in a relationship, like maybe they work too much, or maybe they're not great at responding to communication right away, or whatever, that gives you an opening to be able to say, so here are the things that I do. These are the things that I think are beneficial in a relationship. These are the things that I think are not maybe so beneficial in a relationship. And one of the things that I tend to do when I start to feel more connected or closer or whatever, however you want to word that, sometimes there's this fear that can come up about getting too close. And so that can look like I start avoiding your calls, or I start making excuses for getting together, or whatever that might be. So it's not about warning them about yourself, about how damaged you are, or anything like that. It's about just letting the person be aware of some of those things. Just like when that person is sharing with you, for example, that they're really focused on their career, and so they may not communicate with you throughout the day. They may wait until the end of the day to respond to your text message. That's not necessarily about warning you, right, about how screwed up they are. That's just giving you kind of some guideposts in a way of expectation, so that you know if they're not responding to you, that it's not because they don't want to communicate with you. It's just that they are really focused when they're on during their work hours, and then they'll respond to you later. So it's kind of the same thing. Like if people say that they don't have, like especially like around the like Christmas type of holidays, and you're talking about what you're going to be doing for the holiday, you might share with somebody that you don't tend to spend your holidays with your family. And they may ask a question about that, but again, just because they're asking a question, like the previous video, doesn't mean that you have to answer the question. You could say, it's not really something I'm ready to talk about yet. You could even say, if it feels genuine to you, like, thank you for asking, but it's not something I'm really ready to talk about yet. And that's perfectly reasonable to do. And if more of us felt comfortable being able to do that, no matter what relationship we're talking about, it's just really great communication. And we would all be so much better off in every relationship if we all felt comfortable doing that. And just to be clear, I'm not always comfortable doing that. So it's not like it's a thing that we perfect and it's always great, because anything can make us feel more vulnerable. And anytime we're more vulnerable, those types of conversations are harder. So I think I've addressed everything. I'm just looking at my note here. In terms of how to cope if they don't respond well, first of all, I already said this, but do not take it personally. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, you cannot take it personally. Because think about this. A healthy person, if somebody discloses something to them that is really deeply personal, that is vulnerable, that is traumatic or scary or anything like that, for a healthy person, if anybody is sharing that with them, they may not know the right thing to say, and the right thing is going to be different for everybody. But they're not going to respond in a way that is shaming or dismissive, rude, disrespectful. That is just unhealthy. And that is about them and their issues. So it's never about you. Never. So keep that in mind. If they respond in a way that feels hurtful because you've interpreted something in a particular way, that's when having a conversation, maybe after you've been able to calm your nervous system a little bit, but come back and have a conversation, ask clarifying questions. And if it is actually rude, disrespectful, dismissive, and some of those other things where maybe they've said some other things around or about other people around some of those issues, then it's probably a good indicator that that's not a person that you want to have or try to build a really close, connected relationship with. So, if you have any specific questions on anything that I shared in this video, leave them in the comments below. If you have a general question that you'd like me to answer related to childhood trauma and or healing, send them to Q&A@courageousjourneys.com. And if you found this video helpful, please make sure to give it a thumbs up so other people can find it too. And if you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to do so and click the little bell for notifications. So I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your experiences. Thanks so much for watching. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.